Imagine walking into a shadowy intergalactic auction expecting to buy a simple, rusted-out loading droid, only to walk away holding the leash of a certified apex predator from the most lethal planet in the known universe. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Dan, and today we are diving into a sprawling tale of cosmic misunderstandings, deep space survival, and the strange things that happen when the galaxy's most feared species crosses paths with a captain who just wants her cargo loaded on time. Our story begins far from the gleaming core worlds, out on the absolute fringe of civilized space. Captain Alara Vance did not consider herself a gambler, but simply surviving on the rim required a certain tolerance for risk. The air inside the Kaelen Prime auction house was thick with the smell of ozone, cheap synthesized cigars, and desperation. Neon lights flickered overhead, casting long, bruised shadows across the faces of smugglers, warlords, and corporate fixers looking for off-the-books labor. Ilara pulled her worn leather flight jacket tighter around her shoulders, keeping her eyes fixed on the central auction block. She was a pragmatic hauler, fiercely independent, and the proud owner of the Stardust Drifter, an aging light freighter that was currently held together by duct tape, stubbornness, and prayers. What she needed was a Mark IV heavy-duty loader droid to replace her last one, which had unceremoniously vented itself out of an airlock 3 parsecs ago. What she did not need was trouble. The auctioneer, a multi-limbed creature with a voice like grinding gears, cycled through lots of salvaged weapons and indentured alien mechanics. Ilara checked her cred pad. She had just enough saved for a decent machine if the bidding stayed cool. The holographic display above the stage flashed to the next item, and a hush fell over the chaotic room. A heavy stasis pod was levitated onto the block. Frost clung to its reinforced viewport. The auctioneer leaned into his microphone, his translation collar buzzing with static. He announced a prime, unregistered biological labor unit, salvaged from a derelict transport. The screen flashed a threat classification that made Ilara choke on her recycled air. Class 9 Deathworlder. The crowd murmured in a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Class 9 planets were evolutionary meat grinders. Nothing came from those worlds except highly resilient, incredibly violent apex predators that required heavy sedation just to transport. Ilara wanted nothing to do with it. She raised her hand to signal the auctioneer to skip her section for the next round, a standard gesture on Kaelen Prime. Simultaneously, a brawl broke out 2 rows behind her between a pair of rival spice runners. The sudden violence caused a massive surge in the crowd, violently shoving Ilara forward just as her hand went up. The auctioneer slammed his gavel. He pointed a trembling chitinous appendage directly at Ilara. The translation collar shrieked, declaring the winning bid for the Class 9 asset went to the human female in the front. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain the mistranslation of her gesture, to point out the brawl that had pushed her. It was useless. The heavily armed station guards had already stepped out of the shadows, their plasma rifles leveled at the crowd to ensure all sales were final. In the lawless expanse of Kaelen Prime, backing out of a winning bid was a capital offense. You bought it, or you paid with your ship. Ilara stared at her cred pad. Her entire life savings, every credit she had scraped together running dangerous routes through asteroid fields, had just been wiped out in a fraction of a second. Her account was completely empty, and she was now the legal owner of a monster. The transfer process was a blur of bureaucratic nightmare. Sweating station officials shoved thick stacks of liability waivers at her, demanding her biometric signature while keeping a terrifying distance from the hover sled carrying the still-frozen stasis pod. They warned her that the creature inside had a skeletal structure dense enough to withstand extreme gravity, muscles designed for sustained pursuit, and a terrifying ability to process toxins that would melt a standard alien's internal organs. They called its species human, hailing from a quarantined nightmare sphere known as Earth. Ilara signed the forms with trembling fingers. She had heard the dark legends of Earth, a planet where the weather itself tried to kill you, where microorganisms waged constant biological warfare, and where the native sapient species had achieved spaceflight not through unified cooperation, but by strapping themselves to controlled explosives. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were the boogeymen. They were unpredictable, fiercely territorial, and utterly lethal. The station hands abandoned the hover sled at the docking ring of the Stardust Drifter, flatly refusing to set foot on her ship while the cargo was present. Ilara was left alone in the dimly lit cargo bay, staring at the frost-covered pod. The internal temperature gauge was slowly rising. The stasis field was disengaging. She checked the heavy blaster strapped to her thigh. It felt entirely inadequate. The manifest stated the specimen's name was Jax. She wondered what kind of war criminal or savage beast would emerge when the ice finally melted. How had a human even ended up on a derelict transport in this remote sector? The Galactic Senate had strictly quarantined Earth centuries ago to prevent its aggressive inhabitants from spreading their chaotic influence. The presence of one here, unregistered and in stasis, suggested something deeply illegal and highly orchestrated was happening in the shadows of the galaxy. A sharp hiss echoed through the cavernous cargo bay. The pressure seals on the stasis pod released, venting a thick cloud of white vapor into the recycled air. Ilara drew her blaster, her hands shaking, aiming squarely at the center of the mist. She backed up slowly, putting a heavy cargo crate between herself and the pod. The heavy metal door of the pod groaned and slid open. A massive silhouette stepped out of the fog. He was huge, easily a head taller than Ilara, with broad shoulders and a terrifyingly dense musculature visible beneath the simple, standard-issue transport jumpsuit he wore. Scars crisscrossed his arms, physical testaments to the brutal environment that had forged him. He took a heavy step onto the deck plates, and the solid thud of his boots sent a vibration up Ilara's legs. He rolled his shoulders, the joints popping audibly in the quiet bay, and then raised his hands. Ilara tightened her grip on the blaster trigger, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She braced herself for a violent roar, a sudden charge, the brutal end of her independent hauling career. The apex predator tilted his head, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. He blinked, shaking off the last remnants of cryo-sleep. And then he spoke. He did not roar. He did not bare his teeth. Instead, he cleared his throat, setting the stage for a revelation that would shatter everything Ilara thought she knew about the galaxy's most dangerous creatures. The most terrifying apex predator in the known galaxy did not lunge for her throat, but instead offered a groggy, polite inquiry that completely short-circuited Captain Ilara Vance's survival instincts. Jax rubbed the back of his neck, his massive biceps flexing beneath the synthetic fabric of his prison-issue jumpsuit. He looked down at the heavy blaster leveled directly at his chest, then back up to Ilara's wide, terrified eyes. He offered a small, disarming smile that showcased perfectly uniform, flat teeth. "Excuse me, Captain. Cryo-sleep always leaves me absolutely starving. Could you point me toward the ship's galley?" Ilara blinked. Her finger remained rigid on the trigger, but her brain struggled to process the calm, deep baritone voice emanating from the supposed monster. The corrupt station officials had warned her of feral rage, unpredictable violence, and toxic biology. They had definitely not warned her about polite requests for breakfast. She slowly lowered the weapon an inch, her voice catching in her throat as she gave him simple, stuttering directions down the main port corridor. Jax nodded graciously. He bypassed her completely, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that betrayed his immense gravity-dense mass. He ducked through the standard-sized bulkhead doors, his broad shoulders barely clearing the frame. Ilara followed at a safe distance, her blaster still drawn, entirely unsure if she was witnessing a complex predatory deception or the galaxy's most bizarre misunderstanding. She found him in the ship's cramped, perpetually grimy kitchen. The Stardust Drifter was a working freighter, and Ilara rarely had the time or the energy to scrub the grease from the food synthesizer or the deck plating. Jax, however, was already in motion. He had tied a spare maintenance rag around his waist like an apron and was efficiently sorting through her pathetic stores of dry provisions and nutrient paste. Within minutes, the apex predator had commandeered a heating surface and a dented mixing bowl. He combined milled grain dust, synthetic protein binders, and purified water with rapid, precise movements. The sweet, rich scent of cooking batter soon filled the stale, heavily recycled air of the ship, overriding the usual smell of ozone and old sweat. Jax flipped perfectly golden brown discs onto a pair of ceramic plates. Even more astonishing was his treatment of the workspace. As he cooked, he systematically dismantled the grime. He wiped down the countertops, reorganized the chaotic spice racks, and scrubbed the heating elements until the brushed steel shone brightly under the flicker of the overhead lumen strips. He set a plate down in front of a completely paralyzed Ilara, pushing a small cup of dark, brewed stimcaf toward her. "Terran pancakes," Jax stated, taking a massive bite of his own formidable stack. "Or at least, as close as I can get with these ration packs." "Eat up, Captain." Ilara took a cautious, trembling bite. It was a symphony of texture and warmth, easily the best meal she had consumed in a standard solar year. The sheer absurdity of the situation washed over her in waves. She had just spent her entire life savings on a lethal, quarantined biological weapon, and he was currently doing her dishes while asking where she kept the dish soap. The domestic tranquility was abruptly shattered by a violent, teeth-rattling shudder that rocked the entire vessel. The familiar sickening vibration of the starboard plasma drive failing echoed through the hull. It was a persistent, dangerous leak in the containment manifold. A phantom mechanical ghost that had baffled expensive, highly certified alien mechanics on 3 different starports. They always charged her a fortune, slapped a temporary patch on the casing, and told her she needed to buy a completely new engine block. Jax paused mid-bite. He tilted his head, listening intently to the agonizing groan of the thrusters. Without a single word, he set down his fork, wiped his hands on his makeshift apron, and marched purposefully toward the engineering bay. Ilara chased after him, shouting desperate warnings about high-voltage energy arcs and toxic coolant leaks. Jax ignored her completely. He stepped directly into the sweltering, deafening engine room, his sharp eyes scanning the complex web of pipes and glowing energy conduits. He walked right up to the primary manifold, entirely unbothered by the crushing ambient heat that would blister the skin of a normal species. His dense earth musculature and intuitive grasp of kinetic force allowed him to grab a heavy, stubborn release valve and twist it with his bare hands. It was a physical feat that normally required a heavy industrial hydraulic press. He adjusted a series of primary relays, his fingers flying across the diagnostic panel with an almost terrifying speed and precision. The violent shaking stopped instantly. The engine purred, settling into a smooth, even hum that Ilara had not heard since the day she bought the vessel from a scrapyard. Jax wiped a smear of black grease from his forehead. "Your flow regulator was out of alignment by 3 degrees, he explained casually, as if he were discussing the weather. It was causing a continuous pressure feedback loop in the main thrust chamber. It's locked down permanently now." Ilara stared blankly at the readout panel. Engine efficiency was up 20%. The phantom leak was completely eradicated. She realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that his physical strength was only half the equation. His species possessed an innate, highly aggressive problem-solving intelligence. He was not just a blunt instrument of war. He was a terrifyingly capable, intuitive engineer, leaving Jax to happily familiarize himself with the ship's convoluted schematics. Ilara retreated to the cold isolation of the cargo bay to audit the stasis pod. She needed to understand exactly what she had purchased. The official manifest was painfully blank, listing only his name, his gender, and his extreme threat classification. She slowly circled the heavy, frost-bitten pod, inspecting the heavy magnetic locks and the cryo-tubing. As she knelt to check the structural undercarriage, her hand brushed against a solid metallic square taped haphazardly behind the primary coolant line. She frowned, pulling it free from the heavy adhesive. It was a high-capacity data drive, forged from a dark, unmarked military-grade alloy that felt unusually heavy in her palm. She hurried to her captain's quarters and plugged it into her personal handheld terminal. Instantly, her screen flashed crimson, locking down as a dozen layered encryption firewalls materialized. These were not standard commercial locks. These were military-grade algorithms utilized exclusively by the highest echelons of the Galactic Senate. Her blood ran cold, matching the temperature of the cargo bay. You did not smuggle an apex predator out of a fiercely quarantined sector just to do your laundry and fix your broken hyperdrive. Someone very powerful had orchestrated Jax's illegal transport, and they had deliberately hidden this heavily guarded drive with him. Whatever apocalyptic secrets were locked behind those firewalls held the absolute key to why Earth's ancient quarantine was quietly being broken. If the original owners realized the drive was missing from the transport ship, they would not stop at anything to retrieve it. They would tear the Stardust Drifter apart panel by panel, and they would brutally slaughter anyone who stood in their way. The real question gnawing at the back of Ilara's mind, a mystery that could very well determine if she lived to see the next star cycle, was whether Jax actually knew what he was carrying, or if he was simply an oblivious pawn in a game much larger and far more dangerous than either of them realized. What exactly was the Galactic Senate hiding in the dark? You never truly understand the vast, crushing emptiness of deep space until a heavily armed predator decides you are its next meal. The shrill, pulsing blare of the proximity alarm shattered the fragile quiet of Captain Ilara Vance's cabin, ripping her attention away from the encrypted data drive and sending a spike of pure adrenaline straight into her heart. She secured the metal square inside her jacket and sprinted to the cockpit, her heavy boots slamming against the worn deck plating. Through the main viewport, the familiar starry void was suddenly eclipsed by a massive, sleek vessel. It was a corporate cruiser, heavily armored and bristling with illegal plasma batteries. It bore no public transponder signal, but the matte black hull and aggressive geometric architecture screamed mega-corporation hit squad. A violent shudder rocked the Stardust Drifter as a high-yield tractor beam locked onto her fragile hull. The interior lights flickered and dimmed as the larger ship forcibly leached power from Ilara's navigation shields, dragging her freighter in with terrifying, inevitable force. The comms console flared to life, projecting the harsh, grating voice of a corporate enforcer. He declared a routine sector inspection, demanding the immediate surrender of all cargo manifests and threatening lethal force for non-compliance. Ilara knew exactly what this was. There was absolutely nothing routine about a heavily armed dreadnought shaking down a scrap hauler in unmapped space. They were not looking for contraband or expired transit permits. They were hunting for the frozen asset she had just bought at auction, and the deeply classified encrypted drive she now possessed. How they had managed to track her so flawlessly across 2 entire star systems remained a terrifying mystery, one she desperately needed to solve if she wanted to survive the week. The agonizing groan of tearing metal echoed from the port airlock. They were not waiting for permission to board. Ilara drew her heavy blaster, taking a desperate defensive stance behind the pilot's chair as the sound of armored boots marched down the central corridor. 5 enforcers stormed onto the bridge. They were massive, heavily augmented mercenaries wrapped head to toe in reactive ablative armor, their faces entirely hidden behind dark, featureless visors. They carried customized kinetic rifles designed to punch holes through starship bulkheads. The lead thug leveled his weapon directly at Ilara's chest. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with absolute condescension and brutal intent. He demanded the immediate transfer of all recently acquired biological cargo, casually mentioning that a captain's pulse was not strictly required to authorize the digital transfer. Ilara gripped her weapon with sweaty palms, her mind racing frantically for a way out of an impossible tactical situation. She was vastly outgunned, trapped in the gravity well of a dreadnought, and entirely out of options. She prepared to pull the trigger, knowing it would be her final act. Then, the heavy bulkheads leading to the engineering deck slid smoothly open. Jack stepped onto the bridge. He was completely covered in black engine grease, casually wiping his massive hands on a stained, repurposed maintenance rag. He did not rush. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of gravity-dense muscle and bone, filling the entire doorway. The brutal, unforgiving evolution of Earth was written into every line of his relaxed posture. The enforcers completely froze. The lead mercenary slowly lowered his rifle, the red targeting laser trembling violently against the deck plates. He recognized the physiological markers immediately. He saw the sheer, terrifying density of the human frame, the forward-facing binocular vision of a persistent apex predator, and the absolute calm of a creature that knew with total certainty it was the most dangerous thing in the sector. In the dark corners of the galactic underworld, you heard horrifying stories about Deathworlders. You heard that their bones could shatter industrial steel without fracturing, that they breathed a highly corrosive oxygen-nitrogen mix, and that they healed from fatal plasma burns with terrifying speed. You did not, under any circumstances, engage them in close-quarters combat inside a sealed metal box. Jax took a single, heavy step forward. The structural supports of the deck groaned audibly under his immense weight. He looked at the heavily armed intruders, his expression completely flat, and politely asked if there was a problem with the ship's maintenance schedule. The enforcers did not answer. The sheer, overwhelming terror of his physical presence broke their discipline entirely. The leader took a frantic step backward, stumbling clumsily over the boots of his own squad mates. Without a single order given, the 5 mercenaries turned and sprinted back down the narrow corridor, their heavy armor clanking in chaotic, undisciplined panic. The airlock hissed shut violently, and the corporate cruiser immediately disengaged the tractor beam. Outside the viewport, the massive dreadnought burned hard for deep space, ripping a hole in the fabric of reality to jump to light speed, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and the human as physically possible. Silence descended on the bridge, heavy and thick, broken only by the steady, perfect hum of the newly repaired plasma drives. Ilara slowly lowered her blaster, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the weapon. She stared at Jax, who was casually inspecting a stubborn smudge of grease on his forearm. He had just routed a lethal corporate hit squad by merely existing. She collapsed backward into the pilot's chair, letting out a long, ragged breath that carried the weight of 100 sleepless nights. Jax walked over quietly and handed her the clean edge of his rag to wipe the cold sweat from her forehead. His movements were incredibly gentle, a stark, jarring contrast to the absolute terror he had just inspired in heavily armed veterans. Ilara looked up at him, her emotional defenses finally crumbling. She admitted she thought she was entirely dead. She admitted she had spent her last credit on him by complete accident at the Kaelen Prime auction. Terrified of the monster she had legally bound to her ship, Jax offered a soft, deeply understanding smile. He sat heavily in the co-pilot's chair, the reinforced metal frame groaning in loud protest. In the quiet aftermath, bathed in the soft blue glow of the navigation console, they began to talk, truly talk. Ilara shared the crushing weight of her financial debt, the constant, exhausting struggle to survive on the rim as an independent hauler, and the deep, persistent loneliness of the endless void. She spoke of her desperate need to keep the Stardust Drifter flying, because the rusted vessel was the only true home she had ever known. Jax listened intently, his sharp eyes softening. He spoke of his own home, of endless blue oceans that met the sky, and sprawling green forests that breathed life into the air. He painted a vivid, poetic picture of Earth that starkly contrasted with its nightmarish, blood-soaked reputation across the stars. He described a harsh world, yes, but one capable of profound beauty and unmatched resilience. He spoke of the quiet mornings before the sun rose and the simple, grounding joy of creating something tangible with his own hands. But when Ilara pressed him gently on how he ended up frozen in a smuggler's stasis pod, a dark, heavy shadow passed over his eyes. He smoothly changed the subject, redirecting the conversation to the ship's navigation charts. Whatever profound trauma had torn him from his home world was a heavy burden he was not yet ready to share. Leaving Ilara to wonder what terrible tragedy had forged this gentle giant and thrust him into her life, the adrenaline completely faded, replaced by a warm, unexpected comfort. As they sat together watching the stars streak past the viewport, a subtle, unspoken connection began to weave between them. She saw past the terrifying exterior of the apex predator to the quiet, fiercely protective soul beneath. He saw a deeply independent, resilient woman who refused to break under the crushing weight of a hostile galaxy. It was a solid foundation of mutual respect, a fragile, beautiful spark of romance ignited in the cold dark of space. They sat in comfortable silence, entirely unaware of the catastrophic political storm brewing around them, and the dark secrets burning a hole in Ilara's jacket pocket. There is a certain kind of suffocating silence that only exists just before a violent brawl erupts on a lawless space station. It is the heavy, electric pause right before someone makes a terminal mistake. The Stardust Drifter docked at the absolute edge of civilized space, securing its magnetic clamps to a sprawling, neon-drenched pirate haven known as the Crimson Coil. The station was a chaotic tangle of reinforced asteroid rock and stolen dreadnought hulls. Glowing with harsh ultraviolet advertisements and leaking highly toxic coolant into the freezing void, Captain Ilara Vance needed answers immediately. And the Crimson Coil was the only place corrupt enough to host a black-market digital slicer capable of cracking a military-grade encryption drive. She left the heavy metal square with a multi-eyed arachnid slicer in a subterranean tech den, paying him with a highly risky promissory note drawn against her ship. The alien promised to break the Senate firewalls within the hour, explicitly warning her that merely possessing such a drive was a guaranteed death sentence in any civilized sector. To wait out the agonizing decryption process, Ilara and Jax retreated to a crowded, smoke-filled cantina on the main promenade. The air was thick with the pungent aroma of fermented fungus ale and the low, aggressive hum of a dozen different alien languages bartering over stolen goods and illegal bounties. Jax looked entirely out of place, his massive human frame squeezed awkwardly into a circular booth designed for much smaller, frailer species. He carefully guarded a small, brown paper satchel resting on the sticky table. While Ilara was busy negotiating high treason, Jax had insisted on visiting a local open-air merchant to purchase a rare blend of imported Altarian cinnamon and crushed fire root, absolutely determined to perfect his morning pancake recipe for the crew. The trouble began when a towering reptilian syndicate thug named Vex, decided Alara owed him a retroactive docking tax. Vex approached their booth flanked by 3 heavily modified cyborg enforcers, their cybernetic limbs whining with dangerous hydraulic tension. Vex slammed a scaled, heavy fist onto their table, knocking over Alara's drink and demanding 5,000 credits for the privilege of breathing the station's recycled air. Alara tensed, her hand moving discreetly toward the heavy blaster holstered at her hip. She tried to negotiate, offering a smaller bribe to keep the peace and remain under the radar. Vex sneered, completely ignoring her diplomatic attempt, and reached out to grab the brown paper satchel resting near Jax's massive hands. It was the worst possible decision the reptilian could have made in his long, brutal career. Jax did not yell, and he did not draw a weapon. He simply moved with a terrifying liquid speed that entirely defied his immense gravity-dense bulk. He clamped his large hand over Vex's wrist, the sheer kinetic force halting the thug's movement instantly in midair. Jax politely requested that the syndicate boss refrain from touching his groceries. Vex snarled, baring rows of razor-sharp teeth, and lunged forward, signaling his cyborgs to initiate lethal force. The ensuing violence was a breathtaking masterclass in human kinetic efficiency. Jax stood up, entirely upending the heavy metal table, and casually tossed the 200-pound reptilian across the crowded room into a glowing holographic jukebox. The cyborgs charged, their hydraulic fists swinging with bone-crushing force designed to shatter armor. Jax ducked a heavy metal punch, stepping smoothly into the attacker's guard, and delivered a single devastating palm strike to the cyborg's chest plate. The reinforced armor crumpled inward like cheap tin, short-circuiting the internal cybernetics and sending the thug crashing onto the sticky deck. Jax moved through the chaotic, expanding brawl like a seasoned dancer, his movements precise, calculated, and overwhelmingly powerful. He caught a heavy-thrown stool out of midair and politely set it down, stepping carefully over an unconscious pirate while keeping a firm, highly protective grip on his bag of exotic spices. He did not break a sweat, clearly viewing the entire massive altercation not as a life-or-death struggle, but as a mild, highly irritating inconvenience interrupting his culinary plans. Alara watched from the corner of the cantina, equal parts horizontally terrified and deeply enamored. The sheer physical dominance of the Deathworlder was staggering to witness in close quarters, yet he was fighting primarily to defend a bag of baking ingredients. It was a bizarre, profoundly endearing contradiction that made her heart race for entirely non-lethal reasons, cementing her growing affection for the gentle giant. Before the heavily armed station security could arrive and lock down the promenade, Ilara's encrypted comlink chimed twice. The slicer had finished the job. She grabbed Jax by his muscular forearm, pulling him out of the ruined, groaning cantina and sprinting down the neon-lit corridors back to the subterranean tech den. The arachnid slicer was trembling violently when they arrived, his multiple eyes wide with genuine, unfiltered terror as he handed the small metal drive back to Alara. He flatly refused his payment, violently ordering them to leave his shop immediately before the Senate assassins arrived to sterilize the entire grid. Back in the secure, heavily shielded confines of the Stardust Drifter, Alara plugged the decrypted drive into the main terminal. The holographic projector flared to life, casting harsh, cold blue light across their faces. Files, intercepted communiques, and highly classified tactical maps flooded the air of the cockpit. They were staring directly at a shadow operation of apocalyptic proportions. The Galactic Senate, the supposed beacon of peace and unified diplomacy, was secretly operating a sprawling, highly illegal cloning and drafting facility on the edge of uncharted space. Their target was Earth. The documents detailed a horrific, systematic plan to forcibly abduct millions of humans, actively utilizing their dense musculature, aggressive survival instincts, and rapid healing capabilities to form an expendable, highly lethal proxy army. But the true horror lay in the enemy they were meant to fight. The Senate was entirely losing a shadow war against a highly advanced, rapidly expanding synthetic intelligence in the unknown regions. A cold, mechanical menace that was actively consuming entire star systems to fuel its relentless expansion. The corrupt politicians planned to throw the human race into a cosmic meat grinder to save their own comfortable core worlds. Ilara looked at Jax, the heavy weight of profound moral injustice settling deeply in her chest. The galaxy viewed his people strictly as mindless monsters. Yet the highest echelons of government were actively plotting to use that very ferocity to fight a brutal war they were simply too cowardly to face themselves. How many other humans were currently trapped in stasis pods, completely unaware of the horrific fate awaiting them at the edge of the galaxy? And if the synthetic intelligence was truly as unstoppable as the heavily redacted files suggested, would an army of Deathworlders even be enough to halt the mechanical tide before it reached the heart of civilization? The terrifying truth was out, and they were the only two people in the universe holding the key to stopping a galactic genocide. There is a very specific, undeniable terror in watching the lifeblood of your ship turn into a glowing, radioactive bomb while drifting light years from the nearest friendly port. The true measure of a crew is not found in the calm of hyperspace, but in the blinding, chaotic seconds before total atomic vaporization. The Stardust Drifter was submerged in the pitch-black ink of uncharted space, burning its newly tuned plasma drives to put as much distance between themselves and the Crimson Coil as physically possible. Captain Ilara Vance sat in the pilot's chair, her eyes tracing the glowing navigational holographic charts, trying to process the apocalyptic weight of the decrypted Senate files. The silence of the cockpit was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the life support systems. Jax was in the galley, methodically cleaning up the remnants of their hastily eaten meal, the clinking of ceramic plates providing a bizarre domestic counterpoint to the impending galactic war they had just uncovered. Then, the primary console screamed. It was not the shrill proximity warning of a hostile vessel, nor the grinding mechanical groan of a worn-out component. It was a piercing, dual-tone klaxon that Ilara had only heard once before in a simulator. It was the absolute worst-case scenario. The ship's diagnostic matrix flashed a blinding crimson red, throwing harsh, bloody light across the entire bridge. The main plasma core was destabilizing at an exponential rate. Ilara's fingers flew across the manual override switches, desperately trying to engage the emergency coolant lines. The system refused to respond. Lines of malicious, highly sophisticated alien code cascaded down her terminal screen, entirely locking her out of the ship's mainframe. The corporate enforcers from the dreadnought had not just retreated, they had planted a delayed, deeply embedded sabotage virus into the Drifter's network during their brief, forceful tether. It was a cowardly, invisible assassin designed to trigger only when the ship reached deep space, ensuring it left no wreckage and zero evidence behind. A violent shudder ripped through the vessel, tossing Ilara sideways against her restraints. Down in the engineering deck, a containment seal ruptured. The internal sensors shrieked a new, far deadlier warning. The lower levels were rapidly flooding with unshielded gamma radiation. For most carbon-based species in the galaxy, including Ilara, the current ambient radiation levels in the engine room meant cellular dissolution within 90 seconds. To breathe that air was to invite a swift, agonizing end as the very building blocks of biology simply unraveled. The heavily reinforced bulkheads automatically slammed shut, sealing off the lower decks to protect the bridge, effectively trapping the raging miniature star rapidly expanding inside the engine housing. They had less than 3 minutes before the core breached the outer hull and turned the Stardust Drifter into a fleeting streak of radioactive plasma against the cosmic dark. Ilara fought against the panic constricting her chest. She keyed the ship-wide intercom, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror freezing her blood. She ordered Jax to get to the single escape pod. She explained the core was going critical, and the radiation would melt him from the inside out. She told him to take the decrypted drive, launch into the void, and pray a neutral scavenger ship found him before the Senate assassins did. The intercom crackled. Jax did not respond with words. Through the internal security feed projected on the main console, Ilara watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the massive human ignored the escape pod entirely. Instead, he marched directly toward the sealed, heavy blast doors of the engineering bay. He wore no protective suit. The ship simply did not carry anything capable of fitting his enormous, gravity-dense frame. He ripped a heavy maintenance access panel off the wall, bypassing the electronic lock entirely with raw, kinetic force, and manually cranked the heavy mechanical release wheel for the blast doors. The heavy metal groaned and slid open, unleashing a wave of blistering, toxic heat that instantly distorted the camera feed. Ilara screamed into the intercom, begging him to stop, telling him it was a suicide mission. Jax stepped into the blinding, irradiated inferno. The environment was completely lethal. The air itself was shimmering with deadly thermal energy, and the ambient radiation was spiking high enough to fry unshielded microchips. Ilara watched the feed, expecting the human to collapse, his biology finally surrendering to the overwhelming, destructive power of the universe. But the apex predator from the quarantine zone did not fall. Earth's brutal evolutionary history had engineered a creature of profound, terrifying resilience. Jax winced, his thick skin flushing a dark, angry red as the radiation bombarded his cells. But his heavily reinforced skeletal structure and aggressively adaptive immune system held him together through sheer, stubborn biological defiance. He waded through the sweltering, toxic atmosphere with heavy, deliberate steps. His eyes narrowed against the blinding glare of the failing plasma core. He reached the primary manual venting console. The digital interface was completely melted, rendered useless by the intense heat. He did not hesitate, relying entirely on his intuitive, terrifying grasp of engineering and kinetic mechanics. Jax bypassed the computer entirely. He grabbed the massive, scalding hot physical release lever for the external plasma vents. The metal sizzled against his bare hands, the smell of burning flesh subtly registering on the ship's atmospheric sensors. With a massive guttural exertion of raw physical power, Jax pulled the lever down. Outside the ship, 4 heavy emergency ports blew open along the aft hull. A massive, blinding geyser of superheated plasma and irradiated coolant vented violently into the absolute zero of deep space, propelling the Stardust drifter forward in a chaotic, spinning tumble. Inside the cockpit, the blinding crimson warning lights flickered and slowly transitioned to a stable, muted amber. The core temperature plummeted rapidly as the dangerous pressure was expelled into the void. The ship was dead in the water, entirely without main propulsion, adrift in an uncharted sector. But it was no longer a bomb. They were alive, down in the engineering bay. Jax finally released his grip on the lever. He swayed heavily on his feet, his breathing ragged and shallow before collapsing to one knee against the scorched deck plating. Ilara stared at the monitor, tears welling in her eyes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A profound, world-altering realization washed over her, shattering every preconceived notion she had ever held about the universe. The entire Galactic Senate, the highest echelon of civilized society, viewed humans as nothing more than mindless weapons of mass destruction. They saw them as savage beasts to be chained, manipulated, and thrown into a meat grinder against a synthetic terror. Yet, when faced with absolute, guaranteed annihilation, this so-called monster did not rage. He did not violently try to save himself. His absolute first uncompromising instinct was to walk into a radioactive fire to shield the woman who had bought him by mistake. He possessed the capacity for immense, terrifying violence, but he actively chose selfless, agonizing sacrifice. Alara unbuckled her restraints, sprinting out of the cockpit and toward the medical bay to gather every anti-radiation stimulant and healing patch she owned. The ship was saved, but the man who saved it had just absorbed a lethal dose of cosmic fire. She needed to know if his legendary, terrifying biological resilience extended to repairing massive cellular damage, or if his heroic act had just signed his death warrant in a cold, lonely sector of space. And as she ran, a terrifying question echoed in her mind. How long could they survive drifting aimlessly in the dark before the corporate assassins realized their silent sabotage had failed? There is a profound, terrifying vulnerability in watching an allegedly immortal giant learn how to bleed. The galaxy feared the Deathworlder for his indestructible strength, but in the sterile, cramped quiet of the medical bay, Captain Alara Vance was discovering the heavy, agonizing cost of his survival. Jax lay unconscious on the reinforced diagnostic bed, his massive frame dwarfing the flimsy aluminum structure. The radiation had completely ravaged him. His skin, usually a tough, heavily scarred canvas, was blistered dark red and radiating an unnatural, feverish heat that made the tiny room swelter. Alara worked tirelessly for 3 standard cycles, her hands stained with synthetic biogel and heavy sedatives. She pumped his veins full of specialized radiation flush and broad-spectrum antibiotics, marveling with a mixture of horror and awe at the readouts on the medical scanner. A normal alien physiology would have liquefied within hours of that level of gamma exposure. Jax's body, however, was violently fighting a microscopic war. His aggressive, hyper-adaptive immune system was systematically hunting down the irradiated cells and destroying them, forcing his cellular structure to regenerate at a pace that absolutely defied all known medical science. It was brutal, exhausting work for his biology, and Alara did not leave his side for a single moment. She slept in brief, fitful bursts in a chair pulled close to the bed, waking instantly whenever his breathing hitched or his massive chest heaved with effort. During those long, agonizing hours bathed in the dim amber light of the disabled ship, the last remnants of the fearful, pragmatic captain entirely vanished. She wiped the cold sweat from his brow, her fingers tracing the sharp, proud lines of his jawline. She saw him not as a weapon, not as a terrifying apex predator from a quarantined rock, but as a deeply selfless, fiercely protective man who had willingly walked into a radioactive fire simply to keep her breathing. A profound, unshakable romantic bond crystallized in the absolute silence of deep space. They were tethered together now, bound tightly by blood, immense sacrifice, and the terrifying secrets locked inside her jacket pocket. On the 4th cycle, the ship's artificial gravity gently humming in the background. Jax finally opened his eyes. He blinked slowly against the harsh overhead lumen strips, his gaze finding Alara immediately. He offered a weak, deeply hoarse voice, politely asking if the galley was still intact because he was severely behind on his pancake schedule. Alara let out a ragged, breathless laugh, her chest tightening with an overwhelming surge of relief. She leaned down, burying her face in the crook of his massive neck, letting the tears she had held back for days finally fall against his skin. Jax weakly raised a heavy, bandaged arm, wrapping it securely around her shoulders, his sheer physical presence providing an absolute, grounding comfort in an ocean of dangerous uncertainty. But the quiet intimacy of their survival could not last forever, as Jax's terrifying Earth biology rapidly accelerated his healing, repairing scorched tissue and purging the last of the radiation sickness. The crushing reality of their situation returned to the forefront. They were drifting aimlessly in an uncharted sector, running entirely on emergency auxiliary power, holding a digital bomb that could fracture the foundation of the entire galactic Senate. Ilara brought the decrypted terminal to the medical bay, projecting the horrific files onto the sterile white wall. She walked Jax through the Senate's catastrophic shadow operation, pointing out the coordinates of the massive cloning facilities on the fringe and revealing the terrifying truth about the synthetic intelligence currently consuming the unknown regions. The corrupt politicians were not just planning a defensive war. They were orchestrating the systemic enslavement of the human race to serve as expendable biological cannon fodder. Jax stared at the glowing blue holograms, the soft humor in his eyes instantly hardening into chips of cold, unforgiving steel. The protective, gentle giant vanished, replaced entirely by the lethal, strategic mind of a species that had survived millennia of brutal, relentless warfare. He stated unequivocally that they could not simply patch the engine and hide in the pirate havens. If the Senate successfully breached the Earth quarantine and unleashed the synthetic menace on the core worlds, nowhere in the entire galaxy would be safe. They had a profound, inescapable moral obligation to drag this vast conspiracy out of the shadows and violently expose the architects of this genocide to the trillions of citizens they were actively deceiving. Ilara agreed instantly, her own resolve hardening perfectly alongside his. The objective was overwhelmingly clear, but the actual execution bordered on absolute suicide. They needed to broadcast the raw, unencrypted data to the entire galactic civilian network simultaneously, entirely bypassing the heavy military censorship algorithms and the state-run media grids. There was exactly one facility in the known universe capable of that sheer transmitting power: the central communication relay at Prime Meridian. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Prime Meridian was the heavily guarded beating heart of the core world's infrastructure. It was surrounded by a restricted, heavily monitored warp gate, patrolled relentlessly by elite corporate dreadnoughts, and defended by highly accurate, autonomous orbital weapon platforms. The Stardust Drifter was a patched-together rust bucket with absolutely no offensive weaponry, and a plasma core that had just been manually vented into the void to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. Approaching the relay was mathematically impossible for a stealth run. Jax carefully reviewed the ship's engineering schematics, cross-referencing them meticulously with the classified tactical maps stolen from the drive. A dangerous, utterly brilliant idea began to form in his mind. He pointed a massive finger at the holographic projection of the Drifter's engine block. He reminded Ilara that he had recently permanently locked down the primary flow regulator, drastically increasing the pressure threshold of the main thrust chamber. He proposed a tactical strategy so inherently flawed and violently unorthodox that no sane military computer would ever be programmed to predict it. Instead of trying to sneak quietly past the sophisticated military scanners, they would blind them entirely with raw kinetic force. Jax suggested initiating a controlled, cascading plasma surge. By deliberately disengaging the secondary safety limiters and flooding the repaired thrust chamber with raw, unrefined fuel, they could create a continuous, highly contained miniature explosion. This would propel the aging freighter forward at a velocity utterly incomprehensible for a ship of its class, transforming the Stardust Drifter into a blinding, screaming kinetic missile. The sheer terrifying energy output would create a massive sensor ghost, temporarily overloading the military targeting grids and allowing them to physically punch right through the blockade before the massive dreadnoughts could even lock their weapons. Ilara stared at him, equal parts horrified and utterly fascinated by the terrifying ingenuity of the human mind. It was a plan built entirely on pure aggression and catastrophic mechanical stress. It would push the rusted hull plates of the freighter far beyond their structural limits, threatening to rip the ship apart piece by piece as they hurtled blindly toward the relay. Yet, as she looked deeply into Jax's calm, fiercely determined eyes, she knew with absolute certainty it was their only viable option. They would ride a continuous explosion straight into the heart of the galaxy's heavily fortified command center. The only terrifying questions remaining were how long the ship's groaning titanium spine could withstand the violent, tearing force of the surge before shattering, and even if they miraculously reached the communication buoy, how they planned to physically breach its heavily armored exterior to upload the data while under the concentrated fire of an entire corporate fleet. There is a razor-thin line between sheer piloting genius and a spectacular, fiery suicide, and Captain Alara Vance was currently dancing directly on it. The Stardust Drifter tore out of hyperspace just outside the restricted zone of Prime Meridian, and immediately, the ship began to scream. Every structural support strut groaned in agonizing protest as Alara pushed the throttle completely forward, flooding the newly reinforced main thrust chamber with raw, unrefined plasma fuel. Jax's highly unorthodox, deeply aggressive tactical strategy was working perfectly, turning their battered hauling freighter into a blinding, continuous kinetic explosion. The massive energy output created a colossal sensor ghost on the highly sophisticated military grids. Autonomous orbital weapon platforms, designed to track sleek fighter craft with surgical precision, spun wildly on their axes, their targeting lasers completely overwhelmed by the sheer, chaotic thermal signature of a ship actively tearing itself apart. Ilara's hands flew across the navigation console, her face illuminated by the blinding flashes of near-miss plasma cannons firing blindly into their sensor distortion. She bypassed heavy corporate blockades with violently sharp maneuvers, relying entirely on the extreme pressure threshold Jax had established in the engine room and praying the titanium hull plates would hold. They were a brilliant, screaming streak of defiance cutting straight through the heart of the galaxy's most heavily guarded airspace. But the brilliant diversion could only buy them a few precious minutes of chaos. As the massive central communication relay loomed ahead, a colossal spire of polished metal and glowing data conduits anchoring the sector. The elite corporate dreadnoughts began to manually adjust their targeting matrices, relying on visual optics rather than overwhelmed sensor data. The relay's outer defense mechanisms instantly engaged, projecting a dense physical energy shield over the primary upload ports. They could not simply transmit the files from the safety of the cockpit. The military firewalls would instantly incinerate the wireless data packet before it even reached the receivers. The only way to broadcast the conspiracy to the civilian network was a hard-lined, manual override directly on the buoy's heavily armored exterior hull. Jax stood in the secondary airlock, his massive frame squeezed tightly into a patchwork hazard suit Alara had hastily welded together from 3 standard-issue engineering rigs. He gripped the heavy decrypted data drive in one large hand and a tethered magnetic grapnel in the other. He turned his head, offering Alara a sharp, fiercely protective nod through the reinforced internal window. With a heavy pull of the manual release lever, the outer airlock door blew open, instantly venting the atmosphere and plunging the human into the absolute zero of the cosmic void. The sheer, terrifying vastness of space offered no physical resistance to his dense Earth musculature. But the brutal space battle raging around them provided an incredibly lethal obstacle course. High-yield laser fire crisscrossed the darkness, silently painting the side of the Stardust Drifter with scorching thermal scars that glowed angry red against the black. Jax propelled himself off the freighter's hull with a massive exertion of his powerful legs, sailing through the silent chaos toward the communication relay. He fired his magnetic grapnel, anchoring himself securely to the sheer vertical face of the spire just as a dreadnought's heavy plasma cannon shattered an autonomous defense platform a mere 100 yards away, showering him in silent, glowing shrapnel. He hauled his immense weight up the side of the relay hand over hand, his modified boots clanging silently against the metal in the absolute vacuum. Reaching the primary upload terminal, he encountered the heavy reinforced physical shielding protecting the data core. It was designed to withstand a direct missile strike, bolted down with thick, industrial titanium lug nuts. Jax did not have heavy industrial cutting tools. He had the brutal, unforgiving evolutionary strength forged in the heavy gravity and savage environment of his quarantined homeworld. He anchored his boots against the spire, wedged his thick, gauntleted fingers under the edge of the blast shield, and pulled with everything he had. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched with terrifying kinetic force, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he strained against the heavy metal. Slowly, agonizingly, the thick titanium plate began to warp under the pressure. The heavy bolts snapped one by one, sheared completely in half by raw, unadulterated human power. With a final massive heave that tested the very limits of his makeshift suit, Jax ripped the entire armored plate off the terminal, tossing the heavy debris casually into the void. He exposed the delicate, glowing fiber-optic core of the galactic relay. Without a single second of hesitation, he jammed the heavy, unencrypted data drive directly into the master port. The hardline connection established instantly, glowing a brilliant, undeniable green. Across the vast expanse of the galaxy, trillions of citizens were abruptly interrupted. State-sponsored media grids broadcasting political propaganda, popular entertainment streams, and commercial advertisements entirely vanished. They were replaced simultaneously by the cold, undeniable blue glow of the decrypted files. The evidence flooded the civilian networks completely unfiltered, detailed financial ledgers exposing corrupt politicians taking bribes, classified military maps detailing the horrific systematic cloning facilities built on the edge of uncharted space, highly redacted reports confirming the existence of a relentless mechanical synthetic intelligence actively consuming the unknown regions, and the terrifying realization that the government was hopelessly losing the war. The entire shadow operation, and the horrific systematic plan to enslave the human race as expendable biological cannon fodder, was laid entirely bare for the universe to judge. The upload was absolute and irreversible. But the fatal cost of their success was instantly realized. The massive corporate dreadnoughts, completely abandoning their defense of the now compromised relay, turned their full, terrifying arsenal directly onto the vulnerable Stardust drifter. Ilara screamed over the encrypted comlink for Jax to return immediately. The military targeting locks painted her cramped cockpit in a dozen intersecting red lasers, signaling an impending barrage that would reduce the ship to atoms. Jax pushed off the relay, flying back across the dangerous gap and slamming heavily into the open airlock just as the first concentrated volley of heavy artillery ripped through the space he had occupied a fraction of a second prior. Ilara slammed the manual override, sealing the heavy doors as the internal pressure equalized violently. The ship was hopelessly outgunned, entirely surrounded by a ring of elite warships actively charging their primary plasma batteries. There was absolutely no time to calculate a safe, stable hyperspace trajectory. To stay was to face immediate, complete atomic vaporization. To execute a jump without verified coordinates was a notoriously lethal gamble, risking materialized intersection with a star, a rogue, dense planet, or simply the crushing, inescapable black emptiness of the endless void from which they could never return. She looked at Jax, who was currently ripping off his damaged helmet, his chest heaving with exertion but his eyes fiercely alive with the triumph of their shared victory. She slammed her hand down on the hyperdrive actuator. The rusted, faithful freighter groaned one final agonizing time, the wildly overstressed engines violently tearing a ragged, unstable hole in the very fabric of reality, just as a massive wall of superheated plasma engulfed their previous physical coordinates. The Stardust drifter vaulted blindly into the uncharted dark, leaving behind a completely fractured galactic government, and hurtling at impossible speeds toward an entirely unknown destiny. What profound, chaotic consequences would the unvarnished truth unleash upon the trillions of angry citizens waking up across the core worlds? And would the battered, groaning titanium spine of their vessel even survive the violent transit into the absolute, terrifying unknown? There is a profound, echoing silence that follows the shattering of an entire galactic paradigm. It is the quiet exhalation of a universe waking up to an impossible, terrifying new reality. Trillions of citizens across the core worlds did not merely watch the decrypted broadcast uploaded from the Prime Meridian relay. They erupted in a unified, unprecedented wave of absolute fury. The undeniable, hard-coded proof of the shadow cloning facilities and the cowardly proxy war against the synthetic intelligence ignited a firestorm of civilian outrage that the corrupt Senate simply could not contain with their traditional security forces. Within standard hours of the data flooding the unencrypted network, massive, unyielding protests completely overwhelmed the glittering, heavily policed capitals of the inner sectors. High-ranking politicians, officials who had comfortably orchestrated atrocities from their pristine ivory towers, suddenly found their private luxury dreadnoughts grounded by loyalist air traffic controllers and their secure estates breached by billions of angry, terrified voters demanding immediate, unsparing accountability. The highly illegal Deathworlder draft was permanently halted by an emergency civilian tribunal. Deep on the fringes of unmapped space, the heavy magnetic locks on thousands of stasis pods were cracked open, returning the abducted human biological assets safely to their quarantined, blue and green jewel of a homeworld before they could be utilized as expendable cannon fodder. The dark, heavily classified war was finally dragged kicking and screaming into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny, forcing the military to mount a desperate, unified galactic defense instead of hiding behind a cowardly, systemic genocide. Far removed from the chaotic political revolutions burning brightly through the civilized sectors, the Stardust Drifter floated entirely alone. The blind, wildly desperate hyperjump executed under heavy dreadnought fire had violently spat the rusted freighter out into the very heart of an uncharted, breathtakingly beautiful celestial nursery. Vast, swirling clouds of iridescent violet and deep crimson nebula gas painted the main viewport, illuminating the heavily battered, groaning titanium spine of the vessel. The exterior armor was scorched pitch black from near-miss plasma fire, and the secondary maneuvering thrusters were completely fused into useless, misshapen slag. Yet, deep within the belly of the ship, the primary life support systems and the newly repaired main plasma core hummed a steady, perfect, defiant rhythm. They were completely off the navigational grid, lost in an endless sea of vibrant, glowing stardust, but they were unquestionably, miraculously alive against all mathematical odds. Inside the cramped, dimly lit galley, the sharp, deeply comforting scent of imported Altarian cinnamon and frying protein batter completely overpowered the lingering metallic smell of ozone, burnt wiring, and pure fear. Jack stood casually at the heating element, his massive, heavily muscled shoulders completely relaxed under his makeshift maintenance apron. He expertly flipped a perfectly golden disc onto a chipped ceramic plate, his movements precise and entirely devoid of the lethal kinetic violence he had displayed hours prior. The terrifying apex predator, the man who had literally ripped a reinforced titanium blast shield off a military communication relay with his bare hands while floating in the absolute vacuum of space, was currently humming a low, rumbling, melodic folk tune from his distant Earth homeworld. Ilara leaned heavily against the bulkhead doorframe, a steaming mug of brewed stimcaf resting securely in her hands. She watched him work, a warm, profound affection settling deeply into her chest, rapidly replacing the cold, frantic adrenaline of the past week. She was no longer just a desperate, heavily indebted independent hauler scraping by on the unforgiving rim. And he was absolutely no longer an accidental, highly illegal cargo acquisition. Jax turned, offering her the fresh plate of Terran pancakes with a soft, deeply knowing smile that crinkled the heavily scarred corners of his bright eyes. They sat together at the small, dented metal table, sharing a quiet, impossibly peaceful morning amidst the cosmic dust. It was an unspoken, incredibly powerful acknowledgement of their newly forged partnership. They were true romantic equals, two fierce, unyielding survivors forged in entirely different fires, now utterly ready to face whatever untamed, uncharted adventures the expanding universe had left to offer. Yet, even as they found absolute solace in the quiet dark, the massive ripples of their actions continued to spread outward across the stars, while the corrupt politicians faced swift cosmic justice. A terrifying question remained suspended over the core worlds. Could a newly unified, transparent galactic military truly halt the relentless, mechanical tide of the synthetic intelligence before it consumed the inner planets entirely? And as Alara and Jax prepared to chart a fresh course through the vibrant, swirling mists of the uncharted nebula, they had to wonder what ancient, hidden wonders, or terrifying new dangers, waited patiently for them in this forgotten, completely unmapped corner of the universe. And that, my friends, is exactly how a simple bureaucratic misunderstanding at a shady RimWorld auction turned into the greatest, most explosive cover-up bust in recorded galactic history. My name is Dan, and it has been an absolute thrill guiding you through the incredible high-stakes journey of Captain Alara Vance and her pancake-loving Deathworlder. Thank you so much for tuning in and riding shotgun on this crazy, fast-paced cosmic adventure. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and made you view the galaxy just a little bit differently, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who appreciates a massive dose of deep space rebellion mixed with profound moral lessons. I highly encourage you to hit that hype button right now so the platform pushes this incredible story out to more sci-fi fans just like you. Finally, drop down into the comments section and leave the word pancakes so I know you stayed with us all the way to the very end of the journey. I will see you in the next sector.